probably next week we'll go to Polluntants Pond. That'll be our last lab, because then we have Thanksgiving and then we have the last week, which will be our lab final. Oh, and I posted a PowerPoint that had pictures of the algae that you'll need to know.
Appreciate it. Do they have descriptions with pictures of what they are? Okay.
When do we turn in our lab notebooks?
At the end.
Assuming our last lab day.
Yeah, with the lab final. Any burning questions? I think we have a lecture exam coming up also. Forget what date.
I don't think that's anytime soon.
It's not this week, but anyway. There's a third lecture exam that will happen. Alright, well, today, so finish up the lecture that started with diversity, finish the pollutants, and then we'll get into trophic levels and some trophic stuff with aquatic ecosystems. And so pollutants, we'll start there and just kind of go through, like each slide will have kind of a different class of pollution. And so we have organic pollutants. Did you know the Cuyahoga River caught on fire in 1952?
Did you catch on fire like that many times?
Oh, I don't know.
I think there's.
May have been
It's kinda
multiple
cool.
times. But the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland drains into Lake Erie, and there was, that's a big industrial area, and they had a lot of stuff that was waste that wasn't dealt with properly, and it was floating on top of the water, and it was also flammable, and sparks ignited, and the whole thing went up. So that was like, the river's on fire, this is not right. Anyway, so organic pollutants, so organic as in organic chemistry, organic, with carbons in them, is that right?
Yes.
Thanks. And there's over 10,000 organic compounds that humans have synthesized for their various needs. And of course, a lot of these will end up getting washed into aquatic ecosystems. And pesticides and herbicides also belong to this group. A lot of them do. And yeah, when I first made this slide, Roundup was thought to be relatively harmless. That was before they linked Roundup to cancer in humans. But for a long time, Roundup, the herbicide, was like considered a thing you use because it degrades really fast and it doesn't hurt any animals at all. And so, but there's a study here from 2005 that showed that Roundup was toxic to tadpoles. And, but Roundup is used so widespread and it's so common, and that's how we deal with any weeds on our crops. It seems like it's just spray Roundup all over everything. So, anyway, so that was just a little mentioning of Roundup there. It does degrade relatively quickly in the environment, but it's still having some negative effects. And just kind of a list of some things. Industry, oil and gas, those are all industrial sources of industrial or organic pollutants. Heard of PCBs? I always forget what it stands for, like polychlorobiphenyl, something like that. It's a compound, it's again human produced, and it doesn't like to break down. It has a very long lifespan in, like it can collect in sediments in aquatic ecosystems, and it just kind of stays there. It doesn't really like to break down too well, and then it can also get into the food webs and get stored into fatty tissue in organisms, and so PCBs are a bit of a problem. Another one of those chemicals that when they first developed it, they thought it was this great harmless chemical, and now we're realizing it's not. There are some attempts at bioremediation to try to remove some of these pollutants. And so, like it could be bacteria that are good at breaking some things down. Like there's bacteria that can break down petroleum stuff. And so they can use that on oil spills, or you could have plants growing that are absorbing whatever toxin. You remove the plant that's now got the toxin in it, and then you can dispose of that appropriately, whatever that means. So we have a collection of organic pollutants that are out in our aquatic ecosystems. And that's everything I know about organic pollution, which is not a whole lot. Let's talk about pharmaceuticals and endocrine disruptors. So what happens when you take a drug?
Your
Take a
body
drug,
starts to break it down.
Your body breaks it down, it uses some of it, and the rest of it and byproducts mostly get peed out and or pooped out. And then where does it go after that?
Down the flusher.
Down the flusher into the sewage treatment plant if you're on city water, or into your septic tank if you're not. And when we were at the sewage treatment plant, was there any discussion about how they process pharmaceutical compounds? Nope. There is not, because there's just not. And this is just stuff gets peed out. So pharmaceuticals, endocrine disruptors. So endocrine disruptors are biologically active compounds, as are pharmaceuticals. And they can act like hormones, and they can, in organisms, they can behave like a hormone would. So you could be, and kind of an easy example would be birth control pills. A lot of those hormones get peed out and end up down the drain. And so now you've got estrogens and progesterones floating around that can be absorbed by any kind of organism, and then that hormone can affect something in that organism. So we call those endocrine disruptors, but it doesn't have to be like specifically, like someone was taking estrogen or testosterone. It doesn't have to specifically be a hormone. Some other compound can act like a hormone and cause problems. And so those are endocrine disruptors. So hormones, some other things that also kind of go through the waste system. Caffeine is one of those. So you can actually measure caffeine below wastewater treatment plants. Things like antacids, painkillers, antibiotics also. And so think about, we take all these antibiotics for our various infections, and now we're releasing things into the environment that kill bacteria, and you've got bacteria living in there. So ecoestrogens, I guess this is a term we sometimes use to talk about chemicals that are not estrogen, but they kind of act like estrogen. And so estradiol is a form of estrogen, and apparently some of these compounds can all sort of act like estrogen in the body. They've got bisphenol A. You heard of BPA? We're seeing plastic products that say BPA free. That's this stuff. And so that can be present in plastic. I guess it's also present in thermal paper, like receipts. Like that paper also can have bisphenol A in it. Anyway, but some of these ecoestrogens, so there's a study that linked DDT, which is an ecoestrogen, and it linked it with non-functioning testes in alligators. So it was like this extra estrogen in the environment was reducing the fertility of these alligators.
I don't see how that's a bad thing, considering Florida's swamped by them.
Yeah, they have a lot of alligators, but they're part of the ecosystem. So there's that. Another thing that, just a general class of products that also haven't really been examined too much are personal care products. So this would be like all of your soaps and shaving creams and shampoo and conditioner and laundry detergent, like all that stuff. Where does all of that go? You're in the shower, you use all those things. All of it goes down the drain, right? So almost all of it, and we don't really have a great hold on how those can affect things. So really a lot of unknowns here about how all this stuff impacts ecosystems. All right, switching gears again. Let's talk about acid precipitation. So, our old friend, acid precipitation or acid rain, stuff that comes out of smokestacks, like sulfur compounds or nitrogen compounds, can dissolve in water vapor and form nitric acid or sulfuric acid, and that can make rain or other forms of precipitation more acidic. And do you know what the pH of natural rain is supposed to be?
5.6.
Yes, 5.6. So it's already a little bit acidic. So adding more acid to it, that gets pretty acidic, and that can be damaging to ecosystems. And in terms of how aquatic ecosystems can be affected by acid precipitation, it depends on how much buffering capacity that ecosystem has. So some ecosystems, they have a lot of I want to say they naturally have a lot of tums in them. They've got calcium or magnesium, and so it takes a lot of acid addition to change the pH, and so they may not be affected a whole lot by acid precipitation. Other ecosystems that don't have the buffering capacity, just a little bit of acid rain can change their pH. So some places not affected so much by acid rain, other places much more affected. And we have lots of biological effects, and this table, which is kind of hard to see, shows you pH values where you lose certain species or certain species are harmed. So around pH of 5, decomposition slows down. A lot of our insects disappear below about 4.5. A lot of fish are not happy below about 5. Amphibians disappear below about 5. So if you get a whole lake that's the pH is dropping, or streams where the pH is dropping, you can lose a bunch of organisms if it gets too low. Also, biogeochemistry is affected, so all of our nutrient cycles that Grubauer spent so much time talking about, those can be affected. And you can see some weird things happening, like lower pH can cause calcium or magnesium to kind of get leached out. So like in a stream, there's problems near coal mining areas of what we call acid mine drainage. There's acid mine drainage, and so it's the byproducts of mining coal end up in the streams, and it drops the pH pretty low. And so you can see a lot of calcium or magnesium leaving the system that would normally kind of stay there. Any aluminum that's present becomes more toxic when pH is lower. So that's basically like metal poisoning. And streams that have a lot of acid mine drainage, they often turn orange with the iron sulfur bacteria. If here. Some places they get diatoms that are deformed, like their shape is all messed up. So there's a lot of issues with acid mine drainage. But acid rain has actually been improving, or acid precipitation has been improving because we've been reducing how much junk comes out in a smokestack. And so if you look at, so this is atmospheric deposition of just hydrogen ions in the top two, sulfate, which would make sulfuric acid, and then nitrogen, that would make nitric acid. And in 1994, the levels for all of these were higher than they are in 2007, although nitrogen looks kind of similar. But definitely, hydrogen ions and the sulfates are a lot lower. So we don't see quite as much acid precipitation as we used to. So that's much better. All right, metals. Lead, we hear about lead a lot, mostly from lead pipes that were installed decades and decades and decades ago. But kind of big metals that we talk about, mercury is really a big aquatic pollutant. And it's a problem because methylmercury, a certain form of mercury, it really easily enters food webs and then it gets biomagnified. So as you go up the trophic levels, it gets stored in fatty tissue, and so the higher you go in the food webs, the more mercury can get accumulated. And mercury is a contaminant that's found around the world, so even in like quote pristine places, you can still find mercury. And some places are a lot more contaminated than others, and so this sign here, contaminated fish. So fish in these waters are contaminated with dangerous levels of poisonous mercury. Do not eat fish from these waters. Other places they might have a limit on how many fish you should eat from that area in a week or a month. So some places have a lot of mercury. And then selenium is a problem in the western states. And so groundwater has a lot of selenium in it, and so irrigation pulls up that water. You spread the water out on the land, and then you're basically depositing that stored selenium on top of the surface. And so the evaporation of that water kind of concentrates all that selenium in the soil, and that can cause issues. And it can also then run off into streams. So those are some of our metal issues. All right, road salt. You ever been up north in the wintertime? They salt the roads all the time in the winter. Every single road gets lots and lots of salt on it when the weather looks sketchy. So around here, that stupid brine they use, I don't think that does anything. That's my opinion. I grew up with salt. We put rock salt all over the roads. And I feel like they put the brine out and then it rains and then it ices.
Just washes it away.
Doesn't it get washed away? But anyway, they say it works. But, so up north, Midwestern states, they have a lot of salt up there. And so they can mine a lot of salt out and they can use that. And then, so now you're putting all this salt on the roads and it all washes into aquatic systems. And so here's a stream near a highway and a reference forested stream. So the dark dots show the like chlorine levels, chloride levels, surrogate for how much salt is there. And that stream in the forest looks great. The one by the road, around 1980 something, we see much higher levels of salt there. And so that could be no bueno for little critters in there. So road salt is kind of a thing. When I lived in Boston, they actually used sand on the road instead of salt. They had more sand available, and which seemed to work okay, but after the snow melted and it all dried up and then the wind picked up, it was like blowing sand in your face.
So doesn't that just make the roads more slick with sand on them?
It, I guess, gave you something to grip on. I'm not really sure.
It's not really much of a grip, especially more dangerous for bikers.
It wasn't like thick layer of sand. It was just I don't know. But anyway, that was just the streets that I saw when I lived there. Okay. All right. Some more, a little bit about sediments. Your boss got a lecture about sediment, and he'll talk more about this, but suspended solids, remember our turbidity units? We have the turbidimeter out, so that's what that is. So because of soil erosion, which could be from land use or it could be bank erosion from streams, we get a lot more soil in our streams, which increases turbidity. Makes the water harder to see through. It has a bunch of negative effects like clogging habitat, so where you might have had like gravel or even cobbly kind of habitats with a bunch of spaces in between and all that stuff. Everything can get clogged with this fine sediment, and so then you don't get organisms living there. Reduces oxygen also in this habitat because water's not flowing through it. Gills, not just fish gills, but in insects or mollusks, like all those aquatic organisms have gills for the most part, and gills can get clogged with sediment, and that's also no bueno for those dudes. Or nets, like the net spinning caddis flies, any kind of filter feeder, they can get clogged up. Visual predators are going to have a harder time, and photosynthesizers are not going to get as much sun. So sediment's the biggest impediment in aquatic systems in West Tennessee. It's a problem. But Ruba will talk more about sediments, but we can consider them a pollutant for sure. There's occasionally some thermal pollution, and so that means you have water that's warmer or colder than it should be being deposited. It could be into a lake or it could be into a stream. And so we typically see this in reservoir outflows, so below a dam of a reservoir. So if you've got water coming out of the bottom of the dam, it's going to be a lot colder than that stream would normally expect to see most of the year. If the dam, like, and dams are built to either come out of the bottom or the top, typically, and so if the water's coming out of the top of the dam, and that'll be going into a stream below it, that'll be probably warmer than you might typically expect in that stream most of the year. Industrial outflow, so you can get, even if water is completely clean as it moves through a factory, even if it is deposited completely clean, it could be hotter than you might normally expect. And so you can like warm up a lake or warm up a stream more than it would normally be. I think remember that brain-eating amoeba that I was talking about a while ago? Naegleria, yes. Remember hearing about like some lake in Louisiana, and it was a big lake, but there was a factory on it, and but that area where the factory was discharging warm water was like this hot spot of Naegleria because they really like the warm water. So, it can be all kinds of craziness. then I think our last thing is plastics and microplastics. And so this has been becoming more and more of a thing that we talk about. When I first started teaching this class, we didn't really talk about any of that. And so there's problems with consumers ingesting pieces of plastic and that causing potential health problems, entanglement in things like fishing line and nets and just stuff. There's toxicity, small pieces of plastic that break down, they can release chemicals that are yucky, and then there's just no regulation about plastic discharge, and there's just plastic out there. So,
And there's so many different kinds.
mhm.
Some of them even have traces of fiberglass in them.
Ew, that's nice.
I only know that I've worked at a plastic factory, and we worked with 30 to 50 different
Oh, okay.
types of plastic, and
Mhm.
some of them had traces of fiberglass to not necessarily to strengthen it, it's just what they wanted,
Okay.
honestly.
Yeah, we use.
It had very different levels of toxicity to them. Some of them even caused high shocking. Like we would use totes or whatever to put them in on top of a scale to
Mhm.
count them, and because of that reaction with that or whatever, you reach your hand into the tote, you get shocked, and you would see sparks
Wow.
flying all over it. It was just.
Interesting.
It was just, I don't know if it was the plastic material that it was made from
Mhm.
or what, but it was always that material that caused it.
Mhm. Weird.
Yeah.
Weird, but we use a lot of plastic these days, and we really depend on it. But it's very persistent compound,
It's easy to mold, that's why it's used often.
and it's. I mean, think about like what did we use before we had plastic? So like shipping, we'd have wooden crates with like paper, like stuff or wood shavings, like for padding, and that stuff's really heavy. And so when we're transporting it, we use a lot more fuel to transport that heavy stuff. So
And more limited resources versus plastic can be reused, theoretically.
yeah. Don't know how well it's reused. Like in all the medical and food storage things are a lot safer because of the single-use plastics, and so we depend on them, and they do beneficial things, but
We are able
also-
to reuse some of it because for a lot of the plastic factory, we make stuff for like say General Electric. If it's got certain defects on it, well, they say, hey, this is no good, so we either have to throw it out, which gets shipped to a company that recycles it, or we throw it in a big metal grinder to actually grind up the material and reuse it to make more.
That's good. That's good.
It's not 100%,
Right.
but in the act of it does still recycles it.
Yeah. Heard a lot of stories. I don't know what's true about, like when we try to, we take our recycling in, and like I've heard stories about our plastic doesn't really get recycled like we think it does, and I don't know how true any of that is, but
Yeah, it doesn't. You're not able to just completely reuse the material because in the long run it causes more defects because it's not, I guess you would say, pure anymore because
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
reused.
yeah.
So it.
Some good line. Plastic clicker in my mug with some plastic on it.
Your cell phone, glasses,
My cell phone, my shoes,
trash can behind you.
paper, some plastic on my seat, on this stool. Anyway, I digress. What time is it? Okay, so let's totally switch gears and talk about trophic levels, food webs, and food chains, a little ecosystem ecology, and trophic cascades. Quite as far as we'll get today. So, remember all this stuff? primary producers, decomposers, consumers. Remember all these terms from general ecology? So, so which ones are herbivores?
Primary, primary consumers.
Yeah, primary consumers. And so which ones are carnivores?
Secondary.
Secondary consumers, yeah. So primary producers, all of our photosynthesizers. Decomposers break down waste and dead stuff. And then herbivores, primary consumers, and carnivore secondary consumers. And so when we first learn about this, we try to just, like, we pick an organism and then give it one label, and we call it that. And so this pigeonholing, or just calling a robin a secondary consumer, has been criticized because organisms actually feed on numerous trophic levels. So this is a terrestrial example, but you've got two food chains, one based on dead things and one based on live things. And so you've got dead leaves getting broken down by microbes, which get eaten by earthworms, which is eaten by a robin, which is eaten by a Cooper's hawk. So you've got robins as tertiary consumers eating the secondary consumer, the earthworm. But if you look at the live leaf, that's eaten by the cricket, which is eaten by the robin, eaten by the Cooper's hawk. Robins are secondary consumers. And so it's still the same place, but just when you look at different food sources, you can end up with the same species on different trophic levels. So these kind of food chains are sort of not very realistic, and that's why we talk about food webs instead of food chains. So that's an actual marine ecosystem food web from a published paper, which I should have cited, but I did not. And I don't know if you can tell what's happening here. There's the water level. We've got birds up here, organisms that are higher in the water column, benthic organisms on the bottom, and then all the connections between them all. And some food web people get really nerdy, and they actually calculate how much energy is moving in all of those arrows. And so you see arrows in different sizes. They've done all of that.
Just too much extra work.
That's a lot of extra work, like exponentially a lot of extra work. Okay, so but I want to talk about the trophic cascade. And this is basically where a change at one trophic level has ripple effects on all of the other trophic levels. And in particular, predation at the upper levels can have a cascading effect down the food chain or the food web. And so this is also known as top-down control. And so the idea with this trophic cascade is you can control how much algae is present by whether or not you have predatory fish. So let's look at this little diagram here. And in this pond, I guess, we have algae that are eaten by zooplankton, and the zooplankton are eaten by these little fish, and then nobody's eating these little fish. So if nobody's eating these little fish, there could be a lot of them, and they're going to eat lots of zooplankton, so you're not going to see very many zooplankton because the fish are eating a whole bunch. And then because there's not a lot of zooplankton, there's a lot of algae because there's not enough zooplankton to eat the algae. Well, let's say then that you added a big predatory fish into your pond, like more than one individual. Let's say you threw a bunch of largemouth bass into your pond. So now that we've got more predators, they're eating these smaller fish. We have fewer fish, we will have more zooplankton. We have more zooplankton, we have fewer algae. So with this concept, you're controlling how much algae you have by whether or not you've got a predatory fish. So that's trophic cascade, kind of a top-down control idea. Well, if we talk about top-down control, we also talk about bottom-up control, and again, this would be like control of algae. And you might consider an ecosystem to be more bottom-up controlled if algae are actually controlled by how many nutrients are available, and they're not controlled by what their predators are doing. So if you've got lots of nutrients, you can have lots of algae, and they'll probably be controlled by the predator. If you don't have a lot of nutrients, you just may not have a lot of algae, no matter what predators are doing. And back in the 90s, there were lots of papers that were like, is it top-down or bottom-up control? And the answer is, well, it's kind of both, and it depends, and all that stuff.
We go over that a lot in plant ecology.
Yeah. And when I was at grad school at Georgia, we always had a Halloween party every year, and one year a professor's wife came as top-down, bottom-up, and she had big plastic butt that she put on her chest and big plastic boobs that she put on her butt. So she was top-down, bottom-up. So we're a little risque, apparently. What is this? So just looking again at trophic cascade and just a different diagram. But you have big fish, they eat little fish, no little fish, more predators on algae, fewer algae. No big predator, more little fish, fewer zooplankton, fewer zooplankton, more algae. Alright, so wanted to talk about the trophic cascade to mention this concept is like a management plan for lakes. And some places that might have a lot of extra algal growth that is deemed unsightly or unattractive or otherwise harmful. Someone might say, hey, I think a trophic cascade might help this out if we add some like largemouth bass or some big predatory fish in here. We might be able to control algae a little bit. But we can't just ignore all the bottom-up effects, so nutrients are often the really big driving factor in controlling what algae are doing. So this idea of throwing some fish in may not really make a difference if you have a lot of nutrients. And so, so some other issues with using a trophic cascade as a management plan. I guess if nutrients are super limiting, you wouldn't worry about managing algae, but there's not going to be any top-down control if nutrients are limiting. But my biggest issue with the trophic cascade is when you've got too much algae growing someplace, it's usually cyanobacteria. And do you remember what we said about how tasty cyanobacteria are?
Not tasty.
They're not tasty. They're not eaten very much at all. And so if we have a lot of nutrients like phosphorus and we get a lot of cyanobacteria, you cannot get grazers to control that at all. It's just not going to work. So, so all these nasty cyanobacteria blooms, throwing in fish will probably just end up with dead fish.
Couldn't you throw in some specific bacterial predators?
I don't know of anything that would be a predator on cyanobacteria, because they're generally a lot bigger than like things that eat bacteria, the non-photosynthetic bacteria. I mean, those bacteria cells are really small. And cyanobacteria tend to be bigger and harder to process. Viruses might work if we knew of a virus that was specific to certain cyanobacteria, I mean, that might work. But, yeah, I don't know of anything that can kill cyanobacteria, because they're bacteria, but not other bacteria. So someone could make $1 million figuring that out and figuring out how to kill some of these cyanobacteria blooms. Another management thing that irritates me that Gruba will probably talk about when he talks about lake management is sort of the idea that if you want to support more fish, you should add nutrients, because that'll give you more algae, which will feed the things that feed the little fish that feed the big fish. But what happens when you add a bunch of nutrients? You get the algae you don't want, and they're not going to get eaten. And so we'll talk about that a little bit with Polluntants pond and adding nutrients. But
Tell us what he's doing wrong.
yeah, so I believe he's quite aware of our nutrients. I don't know that he's actually added fertilizer, but he built like platforms where he could add it. And your boss like, no. Once you add it, it's really hard to get out. Okay. Some other issues with the concept of the trophic cascade. So if, where does it want for this or not? Okay, so there's this zooplankton called Chaobarus, and it eats other zooplankton. And it can hide in the hypolimnion from its predators, and then come back either another time of day when the predator is not out, and it can feed on zooplankton. And so you could so even if your fish that are predators on the zooplankton are eaten by the big fish that you added to create this trophic cascade, you could still have predators on zooplankton that you cannot control by adding big fish. So you could still get something that eats all the zooplankton and lets the algae bloom. So if you've got this Chaobarus present, you can do that. Other problems, if you actually do succeed in reducing amount of phytoplankton, amount of algae growing in a pond, that could end up stimulating algae that grow on the bottom, because when you have less algae, the water's going to be more clear, you get more light on the bottom, and you could get more algae growing on the bottom. And that could be like fluffy stuff that you don't want as well. So that can happen. And then just what are you doing to the microbial loop, all the bacteria and everything? We just don't know. All right, 2 more slides. Can you stand it? Can you do it? Okay. So we were talking about trophic cascades in basically like ponds or lakes and the plankton, but we can also talk about benthic areas. And so in lakes, so the algae that grow on the bottom, they're often eaten by snails, and snails get eaten by sunfish. So the addition of something that would eat sunfish would allow snails to be more abundant, and they would control algae growing on the bottom. So that would be a possibility in the littoral zones of lakes. In streams, we've had a few studies showing trophic cascades. So in some California streams, there's a fish that eats midge larvae, which messes with cladophora, this stuff. And so if you have the fish present, they're eating the midge, and I think that encourages the cladophora to grow. If you have something that eats the fish and lets the midge survive, then the cladophora is controlled. So this like big algal growth here may be considered unsatisfying, so we might want to get rid of that. So just some different organisms involved. Streams can also get top-down and bottom-up controls happening at the same time. So if you add more nutrients, you get more algae. If you get rid of snails, you get more algae. Sometimes ecology is sort of a well-duh science. It's like, well, yeah. But until you do the study, you just don't know. And there may be some unexpected effects of trophic cascades. So this was done, I think, in Panama, somewhere kind of tropical. And they had these exclosures, basically like small areas surrounded by an electrified wire, and that would keep catfish out. And these were herbivorous catfish. They've got a little scrapey mouth on the bottom. And so they scrape up algae and they eat it, but also they swim kind of close to the bottom and they fluff things up, and any sediment that settles, they kind of fluff that up and it washes downstream. So they noticed in these exclosures, when there was no catfish, they would get more algae growing initially, but eventually sediment would start to build up on top of everything, and there was ultimately like a negative effect of no catfish on algae. So that was kind of unexpected that the sedimentation would increase without the catfish there to fluff things up and clean it off. Does that make sense? It's kind of weird.
Pretty much there's a reason why they were doing it.
Or just, I mean, coevolution. Everybody wins, sort of. And then trophic cascades in wetlands and groundwater are poorly documented, so we just don't know a whole lot about those things. Alright. Now I'm done. Oh my. I don't know if it'll be me or Grubala sharing this one.
Depending on how he's feeling.